My name is Serge Cipko. I'm the Assistant Director for Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I am also the coordinator of the Ukrainian Diaspora Studies Initiative at the CUL Ukrainian Canadian Studies Center here at CIUS. Today I am discussing my most recent book, Starving Ukraine, the Holodomor and Canada's Response. It draws on a wide range of sources. I have over, if anybody has read the book or has the book, you will notice that the bibliography includes a number of newspaper titles. There's over 90 newspaper titles in the bibliography. In the bibliography as well, there's a list of archives that I visited to conduct research for this book. They include Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa. They also include the Saskatchewan Archives Board in Regina, the Provincial Archives of Alberta here in Edmonton, Ukrainian Community Archives, including the Ukrainian Canadian Archives and Museum of Alberta, also here in Edmonton, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center, Oseredok in Winnipeg. So this gives you a sense of the kind of research that was carried out for this book. The book is about Canada's response to the Holodomor, and what that means is several things. One is how the federal government responded to the Holodomor, or the degree to which it responded. The extent to which it was discussed at any of the legislatures, who discussed it and who didn't discuss it, and especially there's a lot of discussion about how the Ukrainian community here in Canada mobilized around that issue. When I mentioned that there are over 90 newspapers listed, what I've done for this book is I've gone through, I've reviewed the content in the newspapers, and I discuss the extent to which these mainstream newspapers and these other newspapers, the Ukrainian community newspapers, how much they knew about the Holodomor, and how they made sense of that kind of news. So the time frame for the book is 1932 to 1934. In 1932, where I really begin, is the news about people from Soviet Ukraine trying to cross the border into Romania and trying to cross the River Dnister to Romania, and how the Soviet guards were shooting at them and killing some of them. Some of them were able to cross into Romania, and some of them were wounded, but they managed to cross into Romania. And those incidences were covered in the mainstream press, and of course they were covered in the Ukrainian language press as well. So that's where I more or less begin. Then I take the reader later on to what was being reported in the mainstream press and the Ukrainian language press right through 1932 into 1933, and I end with a discussion about the debate over the admission of the Soviet Union into the League of Nations in September 1934. I pretty much end referring to Michael Luchkovich, who was a member of Parliament for Vegreville at the time. He was a member of Parliament, and in the House of Commons, he spoke about the Holodomor in the House of Commons in February 1934. So that's actually a little bit late. But I want to share with you something that he had said in a letter decades later in 1962 about the famine, in an open letter that he wrote to Dean Rusk, the U.S. Secretary of State. And that letter concerned a decision to exclude Ukraine, along with Armenia and Georgia, from the nations that were to have the support of the Department of State as being subjugated nations of Eastern Europe. Now, in the letter, he told Rusk that, quote, and I'm quoting him here, that it was shocking to me in the extreme how little regard was paid to the death of millions of Ukrainian peasants who died in the communist-inspired famine of 1932-33. And it seemed to him then, and I'm quoting him, that the death of an alley cat that had wandered into a park was cause for greater commotion than the demise of such a colossal number of Ukrainian farmers, unquote. And then he asked, quote, where was our world conscience? Did any country speak out with righteous indignation against such genocide? Unquote. And then he went on to say that it was extremely painful. So, in the opinion of Michael Luchkovich, who himself was a member of the Parliament in 1933-34, he thought that it just wasn't really addressed that much. Now, I should say, though, that it was passed in the Saskatchewan legislature in March 1933. There was no official statement on the part of the Prime Minister on the famine. He did make references to starvation in the Soviet Union, but there was an opportunity for the federal government to act in some way, to some degree, on the matter of the famine when the famine was discussed in the Saskatchewan legislature. And there, in March 1933, there were some suggestions of what Canada could do to help the starving people of Ukraine. But the federal government never really took that on. They never really answered suggestions. In fact, what made the federal government hesitant, and it wasn't just the Canadian government, what made the West hesitant, was the fact that the Soviet Union, unlike later on during the famine of 1921-23, the Soviet Union never called for any help in this particular case. So the position of the Canadian government was that, well, if the Soviet Union is not asking for our help, what can we do? So that was the reasoning, if you like, or the way that that was stated. In the press, what you also find is some other arguments that are made that, well, if we do send them any help, is there any guarantee that that help will reach the people who need it? I do want to say, though, that the Ukrainian community in Canada did offer some help through the Canadian Red Cross. They told the Canadian Red Cross that they were prepared to send help in the summer of 1932. And they asked the Canadian Red Cross if they could contact their counterpart in the Soviet Union, which the Canadian Red Cross did do. And the Canadian Red Cross came back with the answer from the Soviet side saying that, well, thank you very much for the offer, but in the absence of real need, we have to decline that offer. And that, for the Ukrainian community, or at least that segment of the Ukrainian community that had received that letter, was already a signal that the Soviet Union was not prepared to the aid that could come from the Ukrainian community, and they were offering up to 500,000 bushels of wheat. So that was a significant amount of grain that they were prepared to have shipped over to Ukraine. So from that moment on, what you find the Ukrainian community doing is two things. They did contact both the provincial and the federal government, but they also decided that they needed to engage in protests. And I counted around 80 protests that were staged in Canada, mostly by Ukrainian groups, not exclusively, during 1933 and 1934. In fact, I could give you a sense of what was said at those protests because I do have a resolution that was passed during one of these protests, and this is one, or the example that I'm using is about a protest that took place in Dauphin, Manitoba on the 29th of October 1933. And the resolution begins as follows, and I'm just going to quote through it. Whereas the population of eastern Ukraine, now part of the Union of Soviet Republics, is at present suffering severely from famine, and several million died of starvation during the 1932-33 season, and whereas Ukraine, possessing one of the richest and most fertile soils suitable for agriculture, has been known as the granary of Russia and Europe, and whereas the present condition of famine and starvation in Ukraine has been brought about not by natural causes, but by the systematic and ruthless collection of all grains and foodstuffs by the Russian Soviet government for military purposes and export, and whereas the Russian Soviet government officially denies all reports of famine and starvation in Ukraine, and by doing so precludes all possibility of assistance to the victims of famine by the civilized world, and whereas the offer of the Ukrainians in Canada made several months ago through the Canadian Red Cross Society, so this is the example that I shared just a moment ago, to their starving brethren in Ukraine was declined by the Red Cross and Red Crescent societies of the USSR as not necessary in the absence of real need. And whereas the Ukrainians in Canada continuously receive letters from their relatives in Soviet Ukraine reporting death from starvation of their fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters, which reports are substantiated by immigrants from Soviet Ukraine to this country, and whereas requisitions and collections of all grain by the Soviet government officials in Ukraine continue despite the existing appalling conditions of famine and starvation, and whereas in view of the above fact, it appears that the Russian Soviet government deliberately tries to starve out the masses of the Ukrainian population, therefore be it resolved that we, Ukrainian Canadians residing in the town and district of Dauphin in Manitoba, assembled at a mass meeting in the Ukrainian People's Home in Dauphin this 29th day of October 1933, voice our strongest protest against the Soviet government, which by its policy of ruthless grain collections from the starving population of Ukraine aggravates and prolongs the conditions of famine and starvation in Ukraine, and appeal to the opinion of the civilized world in the hope that it will force the Soviet government to cease this inhuman policy of starving out the population of Ukraine. End of quote. So this is an example of a resolution that was passed at one of these Vichy, these meetings. And these resolutions were sometimes directed or sent to the provincial government. They were often sent to the federal government. Sometimes they were sent even to Geneva, to the League of Nations, and sometimes to the American president in the United States. So he had a good sense of how the community saw things in 1933 and the extent to which they knew about the famine. The Canadian government did not like the Soviet Union. It was a conservative government. They were very concerned about the communist movement in Canada, and they felt that the Soviet Union was abetting that communist movement in Canada. So they cracked down on communists in Canada in 1933, 32, 33. Canada had imposed a partial barrier to trade with embargo of trade with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union retaliated with a complete embargo of trade with Canada. So the relations between Canada and the Soviet Union poor. If I was going to summarize, some of the statements that I make in the book, and these are not so nice, really, I may be quoting from others. I would say that the attitude was something along these lines, that yes, we find these conditions in the Soviet Union, appalling. Yes, we sympathize with these protests, but there is nothing we can do. There is nothing we can do because any actions would be considered unacceptable to the Soviet Union. In other words, if the Soviets are not asking for that for any help, then there is not much we can do. And that was the attitude of the League of Nations as well. When the League of Nations, which Canada was a member, did discuss the famine behind closed doors, the decision was made that, the Soviet Union is not a member of the League of Nations. The best course of action is to go to non-governmental bodies like the Red Cross. And, for the segments of the Ukrainian community to hear this, the reaction was, well, we've done that. We tried that route, and it hasn't got us anywhere. So, in effect, they continue to stage these protests until somebody could perhaps listen. They wanted to draw attention to what was happening in Ukraine through these protests. And Richard Bennett did make a statement through his foreign secretary at the League of Nations in 1934. So the person who represented Richard Bennett in Geneva during the debates about admitting the Soviet Union in September 1934 did mention the famine and said that he hoped that with the Soviet Union entering the League of Nations, that they would allow aid to pass through when people were in distress. Well, for the Ukrainian community, that is the community that was not pro-Soviet, because there was a pro-Soviet Ukrainian community in Canada as well. And the pro-Soviet community tended to publish reports that appeared in the mainstream press that downplayed the famine. So they didn't protest the famine. In fact, they downplayed it, and that said that there wasn't a famine, or it was reports about famine were exaggerated. But the larger part of the Ukrainian community, as you could sense, from that resolution, thought that what was happening was totally unnatural. That there was this effort to debilitate the Ukrainians, and that this famine was done simultaneously with an assault on the Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian language, such as Ukraine. That this was done deliberately to weaken the Ukrainian nation. And I give a lot of examples of editorials in the Ukrainian language press at the time where this sentiment is expressed. The Ukrainian community was also aware that it was possible to help people individually in Soviet Ukraine. For example, there was an awareness that there was a way of sending a little bit of help through the Torgsin system, that is the all-union company for trade with foreigners. That was a supply house in Moscow, which had distribution centers across the Soviet Union. And the Torgsin would supply a package of requested materials, which would consist of food and or clothing, in return for foreign currency. So that was the catch, that you had to send foreign currency, because the Soviet Union was trying to get as much foreign currency at the time as possible. I was able to find a letter that, in fact, somebody tipped me off about in Calgary, and I could read out part of the letter that came to Calgary by requesting help to relatives in Calgary. This particular case is a letter that came from the village of Zarechye, near the city of Proskuriov, which since 1954 is Khmelnytsky, It was written on the 1st of March 1933, but left the post office in Soviet Ukraine much later and arrived in Calgary on the 21st of May 1933. The letter was directed to the sender's father and it seems stepmother, and it read as follows. So I'm quoting from this letter. I'm quoting the translation from this letter. This letter is from your daughter Maria to her father. I inform you, dear father, that I am at this time, thank God, still alive. I ask you, dear father and mother, to send me any help you can, because I am dying of hunger. While I was with mother, she was to feed me, but mother has now died, and I am alone and perishing from hunger. I cook fodder beets and live off them. I go around to the store, the Torkson, where they get flour from relatives in America, and they get all kinds of food products, but I can only look and cry and then go home. I sit at home and ask that you not ignore my request. I have written so many letters to you, but have not received any reply from you. End of quote. So this was the kind of letter that was able to come to Canada because, what's important to note about this letter, among many other things, is that these letters came to Canada. They came to Canada because the Torkson system was a good way of getting foreign currency. So sometimes, letters like this one were published in the mainstream press. They arrived in very large numbers to the Mennonites in Western Canada as well. I should note that the Ukrainian community here in Canada was largely descended from immigrants from Western Ukraine, but that had no real bearing because they still were able to raise some money and through a committee were able to get it to people in Soviet Ukraine. The problem here was that you could probably help 1,000 or 2,000 people in Soviet Ukraine, but imagine how many people needed that help. We know that millions of people died from starvation. Yes, a few things. In fact, one was what I would call the Dnister tragedy, this Dnister affair, where people were trying to cross the frozen Dnister River to Romania, and it's something that I didn't really know that much about before. So I was surprised how much attention was devoted to that, and then I became even more surprised as to why there weren't any subsequent reports, because the majority of reports were in February and March 1932, and then the coverage stops from around April onwards. Although in the Ukrainian community press there were still some references to these attempted crimes and to the refugees and to the topic as a whole. So it never disappeared completely from the Ukrainian language press, but it did disappear from the mainstream English language press or French language press as well, because I looked at both the mainstream English and French press in Canada. Another one was, and I was actually glad that I decided to extend my time frame to 1934, was the debates about admitting the Soviet Union into the League of Nations. And I was, I suppose, a little bit disappointed that there wasn't more said about the famine during those debates. But, Canada was one of the countries that did mention the famine during the Canadian representation in those debates. So, these are two examples. The other one is that in that resolution that I read out, there was a reference to immigrants. Ironically, it was actually made easier for people to immigrate to Canada in 1933 than, say, 1932 or 31, for that matter. But still, as the mainstream press had noted, that it was extremely difficult. You needed a lot of money or your relatives to come up with a lot of money to sponsor you. And then number two, it would be up to the Soviet authorities to decide who could leave. But that reference to immigrants is noteworthy because the Ukrainian language press and the mainstream press did make a reference to three immigrants, all women who came to Canada from the Soviet Union. We know that two of them came from Ukraine, and the third one it's unknown. There's no references in the press reports as to where the third one came from, but we know that she came from the Soviet Union as well. So those three individuals confirmed there was a famine in Ukraine, and they became a source of information about conditions there. I take a pan-Canadian view in my book. I draw from newspapers from coast to coast, and the coverage was quite similar. Sometimes they would all take reports from the Associated Press, from cable or the United Press, and the coverage, was. There was some significant coverage about the famine. It was rarely front page news, but there were references to the famine in the Canadian press. Where the Western Canadian press really differs is in the coverage of the protests. So wherever there were large numbers of Ukrainians, the Ukrainian settlements, for example, in Winnipeg, Edmonton, Saskatoon, and then in the smaller cities, Vegreville, and other places across the prairies. There you find additional information because they reported about they reported on the protests, and sometimes there were letters to the editor as well. That were submitted by members of the Ukrainian community. One conclusion that I suppose I come to from the study is the fact that there was knowledge about the famine in Canada, and from the examples that I give in the book, that knowledge extended from coast to coast. The part of the problem was the fact that it's not very clear whether the people reading these conditions in the Soviet Union, whether they understood the magnitude. In fact, I think that probably a lot of people didn't understand the magnitude of the catastrophe that was that was taking place there, and that was partly because there was contradictory information that was coming from the Soviet Union. The Soviets, were quoted as denying the famine at the end of March 1933 in the mainstream press. So if they were denying that there was a famine, people in Canada and elsewhere would wonder, well, if they're denying it, is the situation as bad as as other people are portraying it to be? And then, what also confused matters is that the Soviet Union later on kind of gave a partial admission that something had gone wrong earlier in 1933 and at the end of 1932. There was a Soviet official, Alexander Asatkin, who said, yes, something went wrong, but the situation wasn't as bad as it was portrayed in the West. There were thousands of people that suffered, and he wouldn't use the word famine, but just made it known that people had suffered, and then then he basically said something along the lines that the people were starving were the people who did not want to work. So this was the Soviet line that he who will not work will not be fed either. So so that's the kind of line that the Soviets were presenting to the West. One thing that I would like to draw the attention of the viewers is that if they do pick up this book in a library or somewhere, that there are some eyewitness accounts. I mentioned those three immigrants, and I tried to get as much out of those the accounts and look for any accounts that they had that were presented in the Ukrainian language and mainstream newspapers at the time. So there are some eyewitness accounts, and there were some letters to the editors that included excerpts of letters that had been received from relatives in Soviet Ukraine. So that's, I think, adds to the inflation base of the basis of that book as well. It's I share that information that I was able to find in the newspapers. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book. Thank you very much.